Thanks for staying with us. You're watching The Agenda. South Africa launched the 16 Days of Activism for No Violence Against Women and Children campaign. This year's campaign, which takes place annually, started on the 25th of November and will run to the 10th of December. It's under the theme Letsema, men, women, boys and girls working together to end gender-based violence and femicide. The government announced last week that gender-based violence would now be classified as a national disaster. For more on this now, we're now joined by Steve Letsike, who's the Deputy Minister in the Presidency for Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. Deputy Minister, thank you so much for your time on the program. So we mark this period annually, as a time for us to reflect as a collective, as South Africans, around GBV in particular. Just how would you describe the state of the fight against gender-based violence right now as we have this chat?
No, thank you so much, Nkolisi. Let me also greet the viewers. Look, one must accept that we have a crisis in our country. The crisis that is influenced by many issues, socially, economically, but also to some extent in terms of the behavior and attitude. But this is rooted because, at homes, in schools, we need to prevent this. So the crisis that we are seeing where you have 33.1% of women in South Africa having experienced physical violence. And then you've got children, 1 out of 3 girls have experienced physical or sexual violence, and 1 in 5 boys as well. So which is already telling you that the majority of people affected by violence, yes, it's women, it's children, it's vulnerable groups such as LGBTI and persons with disability, but you also have men that are completely also violated in many ways.
So the classification of gender-based violence as a disaster, Deputy Minister, this forms part of efforts by government, as we understand, to help in the fight against gender-based violence. But here's the thing, year in, year out, this is seemingly a conversation we are able to play and pause and then pick it up again, same time next year. These are no new efforts that we're seeing now. Just how different or what shape should the fight against gender-based violence be taking this year, especially when we look at some of those campaigns that have subsequently mobilized South Africans across the board. We've seen the likes of the purple display picture on the social media platforms, as well as the silent protest that also happened last week. Just how must this one be different when we compare it to the other ones?
Look, I think first, the appreciation that South Africa has recognized is the issue of a crisis, that we are faced with this persistent high level of gender-based violence and femicide. But President Ramaphosa in 2021 already pronounced gender-based violence as the second pandemic after COVID. So this is also not new because this has been persistent for so many years. But now the outcry is actually saying pause. And we've seen many organizations, whether it's Women for Change, whether it's the African National Congress, Women's League, that have been leading different initiatives that raises awareness. But they've called for one common agenda, which is declare gender-based violence and femicide as a disaster in our country. And this classification, you would understand, it's legally bound by our own Disaster Management Act. And that classification as a national disaster, it's under that Act, Section 23. But let's explain it very clearly, because then it empowers us as a country to really look at an event where you have a disaster declared, whether locally, provincially, nationally, then you then have to look at the magnitude of that well-coordinated response to deal with the prevalence, but also look at an evidence-based response, qualify it in the way that that section empowers that. So the primary responsibility of Section 23 assigns the responsibility of coordination. And while the state evokes emergency regulations in that case. So that's what that act says. But you need to then put at the heart of it, how do you then assess, how do you find persistent, immediate life safety that you have to empower? You need to save women, you need to save children, you need to save vulnerable groups in the country, because it's a security concern if men continues, if boys continues to harass women. So that is the coordination aspect of it, that all spheres of government must work coordinatingly so, but also work at a multi-sectoral level. Experts will be there, will be driven by evidence, will be driven by the proper coordination that responds to the pandemic.
Your response now, Deputy Minister, points to a need for dialogue, and not just dialogue, but open and honest dialogue about gender-based violence, on how did we actually get here? Just how are we faring in terms of addressing what has also been deemed as some of the root causes of gender-based violence, particularly when we look at us as men in the country, as well as some of the stereotypes that feed into toxic masculinity, particularly around navigating these conversations, because there is a need, and that greater need is to say, look, the entire community needs to lend a hand in the fight against gender-based violence. Are we really addressing the root causes here, or are we doing all of this at the superficial level?
Well, I think there's quite a number of issues. One, we must accept the root causes and the drivers. We must be very clear on that. Patriarchy or patriarchal norms, gender inequalities is at the heart of this. Cultural violence. If you have a young girl, 13, 14 years, who's getting married by a 46-year-old, that's unacceptable. So how do we defend? How do we want to hide behind culture or religion to actually demonstrate and say that this is what is happening? The second issue, substance use and abuse, poverty and unemployment, and what young people and South Africans are consuming online, social media, soft violence, pornography, all of these things. But also it then also speaks to the issue of law enforcement that needs to be consistent and where justice is also found. So we cannot divorce ourselves in understanding the laws in our country. We've got so many laws that have been introduced, one that are survivor-centered, that is putting survivors at the center, but at the same time, the issues and attitudes at home, no home is regulated. Many of the violence that's happening is happening through the intimate partner violence. These are people who claim to love the women. Secondly, you've got children who are violated. These are people who are supposed to support and keep young people safe. So this goes back to the patriarchal norms, the kind of attitude and behavior. It's following us in our homes, it's following us in schools, it's following us in communities. Now it then says, how are men in South Africa confronting the issue of gender-based violence? It cannot be, there cannot be any excuse to raise a hand, rape a child, or even murder somebody. This is a confrontation about honesty about this level of violence.
Right, and of course, greater conversations must indeed be had around that. And Deputy Minister, I like that you also made that example around ukuthwalwa, which is still, a huge problem, particularly when we look at the rural areas. And this is a problem that has, raised emotions across the board in the country. How do we echo some of these sentiments that you're sharing with us right now, particularly with those communities that really need to have this message hammered to them?
Indeed, look, I think we have made strides as South Africa over the years that we've reduced the issues of ukuthwala, child marriages, and we've seen it, whether you're talking about historic elements around the Eastern Cape or the KwaZulu-Natal data, but even in some of these provinces, we've seen a reduction, but that it's also still persisting. No child should be forced to marry. And we know at the heart of this child marriage, it's parents and it's also guardians. This issue that parents and guardians can negotiate, can trade, can think that, it's a child is a transactional arrangement must come to an end. And I think these are things we must confront. Yes, we understand that, we've had this historically, this has been cultural practice or religious practice, but we then have to say, in this 21st century, what are some of the harmful practices that we are confronted with in society that perpetuate and exposes young people into vulnerability? We cannot say in a democratic country that says, children cannot consent to sex when they are 16 and below, but yet parents or adults think that it's okay and it's normalized to transact with a child's life in that bed in the name of culture and in the name of religion. I think culture and religion are beautiful things, but we must never abuse them.
All right, that is Deputy Minister there, Steve Letsike, joining us on the program. I must thank you so much for your time and insights right here on the program. Steve Letsike is the Deputy Minister in the Presidency for Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities.